allow a few more moments to let people enter the room before we get started. Great. So good morning again, and good afternoon, especially to our panelists who are overseas. I'm Khaled El-Gindi. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs. And I'm very pleased to moderate today's webinar, which will be focused on the question of, has Israel officially annexed, or Israel's annexation of the West Bank already underway? For many years, we've talked about Israel's settlement enterprise as a form of de facto annexation, as well as a direct threat to a two-state solution. However, since the government of Israeli Prime Minister, the far-right government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we've seen an even greater increase, in fact, an unprecedented acceleration in settlement approvals, roughly 20,000 settlement housing units, more than any previous year on record. Moreover, the Netanyahu government has put in place new measures that effectively transfer key authorities over the West Bank from Israeli military to civilian authorities, a move that many people, including many of our panelists, regard as a step toward de jure and not just de facto annexation. We'll talk about what both of those terms mean in a moment. Today's discussion is all the more relevant in light of Monday's landmark vote in the Knesset to strip Israel's Supreme Court of its ability to review government decisions and appointments. The first step in the far-right Israeli government's planned judicial overhaul, which of course, as many of you know, has been met with massive protests and turmoil across Israel. We'll talk about the relationship between the push to do away with judicial checks and balances in Israel and the question of Israel's annexation of the territories it has occupied since 1967. But first, let me introduce our excellent panel of speakers. I'll introduce them here briefly, but you can view their full bios on the event page for today's webinar. First, we have Wissam Ahmed from Al-Haq's Center for Applied International Law in the West Bank. Next, we have Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Then we have Dalia Scheindlin, Policy Fellow with the Century Foundation, among many other hats. And last and certainly not least, Michal Sfard, a very renowned Israeli human rights lawyer. So I'll start off the discussion with some questions, and then toward the end, we'll try to incorporate as many of your questions from the audience as we can. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to get to those time permitting. So let's go ahead and get started. So just by way of setting up, last February, less than 2 months after taking office, the new government of Benjamin Netanyahu adopted a set of administrative procedures that, among other things, transferred certain authorities over life in the occupied territories from the Ministry of Defense to civilian authorities in a way that legal and political scholars have argued effectively crosses the line from de facto to de jure, or official annexation. We're going to break that down in a moment, but first I want to start off with some basics. Specifically, I want to start with you, Michal. We often hear people argue that, mainly on the pro-Israel side, that the West Bank and East Jerusalem are not occupied. If anything, maybe they're disputed. But in any case, Israel's hold over them is not a military occupation. And that settlements are really just like other ordinary Israeli communities. What is the legal status of these territories, and why does it matter? And what's the problem with Israel building settlements in these areas?
Thank you, Khaled. And I really want to thank the Middle East Institute for inviting me. I'm really happy and privileged to be here with so many participants that took time to listen to this issue. The term or the concept of disputed territory may not collide with the insight that the territory in question is an occupied territory, because the two concepts do not come from the same discipline. Occupied territory is a legal concept. It's grounded in international law. It's a status, it's a legal status of a territory. And if a territory is under that status, that confers rights, powers, obligations, limitations on the administration that controls it, and on the people who are living there, the residents, the civilians in that territory. Disputed territory is not a legal concept at all. It may be a description, a political description of a situation. If two parties have claims to a territory, then under, in international relations, we would say that the territory is in dispute. But whenever my colleagues in the Justice Ministry of Israel or the Legal Justice Corps of the Israeli Army say that the territories are disputed territories, I beg them to teach me the laws of disputed territories, because I probably missed that course in my law school. There is no such thing. Now, the other question you asked, Khaled, is what is the correct description of the Palestinian territories that are under Israeli control, that have been conquered in 1967. And usually in many questions that I'm asked, I'll start by saying, well, my opinion is, and here I don't have to start with this disclaimer, because unlike in most issues, most things in law, that lawyers make a living out of disagreements. But this is one of these rare cases where there is a complete consensus, almost complete consensus, not only among legal scholars, but legal international institutions, tribunals, courts, and even the Israeli Supreme Court, that the territories captured by the Israeli forces in 1967 are occupied territories. And your last question was, so what are the implications of that kind of classification when it comes to settlements? Well, we don't have much time to discuss the main principles, the goals and the purposes, the objects of this international field of law that is called international laws of belligerent occupation. But I'll just say that one of the main goals is to make sure that one party does not acquire sovereignty by force, unilaterally, without an agreement. And in order to cement that idea, that is basically a support pillar for the most important novelty in international law in the post-Second World War international legal order, the idea that force is not legitimate. Use of force is not a legitimate tool in international relations except self-defense. So in order for not allowing a party to acquire sovereignty through force unilaterally, it is also completely prohibited to transfer directly or indirectly, to incentivize your own population, your own civilian population, to immigrate into the occupied territory. Because if you do that, then you entangle and prolong the life of occupation, and you do not make it short, which is one of the most important objectives of the international laws of occupation. So to sum it up, just to say, each and every housing unit in a settlement in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in Gaza, when there was one, is illegal under international law, is a violation of international law, and not just any norm of international law, but one of the most fundamental norms.
Thank you, Michal. I would just also point out to folks in the audience that keep an eye on the Q&A box. I'm sorry, the chat box for resources related to our discussion. Aaron, I'd like to come to you next and ask you to talk a little bit about the U.S. policy side as someone who served in numerous U.S. administrations, both Republican and Democrat, and as someone who's been around the peace process pretty much from its inception. How has U.S. policy dealt with this question of occupation and settlements? And if you could also, how have those policies evolved over the years in either direction, for better or for worse? Aaron, you're muted.
Let me begin again. Thanks, Khalid. It's great to be here with Wissam and Dalia and Mikhail. Ironies, contradictions, hypocrisies, inconsistencies abound in most nations' foreign policies. On this issue, I think they're particularly acute. Looking back on U.S. policy since 1967, I think it becomes very clear that, and it's sort of ironic, before there were direct negotiation, before there was anything that you could even describe as the peace process, a term coined by Hal Saunders in Kissinger's initial shuttles during the Israeli-Egyptian negotiations. Before any of that became the focus of U.S. policy, Washington actually was more inclined to articulate positions in line with much of what the international community believed on these issues. The word occupation, illegality of settlements, application of the Fourth Geneva Convention, occupied territory. These were concepts that actually appeared in U.S. policy statements and assertions, beginning in the 70s, and certainly by the late 80s, and absolutely by the early 90s. The deployment of any and all of these concepts became, at a minimum, extremely elastic. And in reality, application of these terms were avoided, not to mention the fact that there was very little support for arguing in favor of that. I believe that several factors contributed to this new reality, which I might add, colleague, exists now. One is the growing centrality of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the special relationship, and for any number of reasons from policy and politics to cater to Israeli needs and requirements. And second, the focus on direct negotiations, which were literally sanctified. I've written about this in an article in 2010 called The False Religion of Middle East Peace and Why I'm no longer a believer. Negotiations and direct negotiations became literally a religion. The word religion derives from the Latin religio, meaning to adhere and bind. And I can speak from personal experience. I was a key proponent of the notion that, in fact, putting the focus on principles would not allow these negotiations actually to succeed. What needed to be done was to deal with practical reality. And when it came to settlements, the Israeli occupation, the view very much was, well, in a productive, functional negotiation, with a relative asymmetry of power between the two sides, if one could be created, that a lot of this stuff could be resolved between the parties. And what drove this, in large part, was this faith in the power of negotiation. And I would say this was not a situation in which the United States forced the Arab interlocutors to accept this. There's a certain amount of agency in an effort to put most of the responsibility and blame on the U.S. for the abandonment of principles. The fact is, Sadat, as early as March of '78, basically told the American negotiating team that he was prepared to settle with the appropriate sort of rhetorical cover for a separate peace with Israel. That was one example, and Sadat delivered on it. The autonomy negotiations never had a chance of succeeding. I think Sadat knew that. Arafat's embrace of Oslo was another example of the subordination of principles to, I would argue, personal ego. Arafat essentially accepted an interim approach, not abandoning any of Palestinian desiderata or irredenta with respect to statehood, but Arafat literally put the issue of his personal involvement in the process over the issue of principle. He was the key address for the international community, for Israel, and for the United States. So these sorts of factors created a situation where the applicability of international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, the use of phrases like East Jerusalem as occupied territory, literally were left by the wayside. They made a brief appearance, Oliver, I think you know, during the Bush-Baker years. George H.W. Bush was hammered for a press conference in 1991 or 90 in which he referred to East Jerusalem as occupied territory. But even the Bush administration and my former boss, James Baker, other than Kissinger, probably one of the most extraordinary negotiators, understood that if he wanted attendance at the Madrid Peace Conference, if you wanted the onset of negotiations, you're simply going to have to subordinate principles to these needs and these practicalities. And as you know, it's quite clear these concepts have not reappeared, certainly not in the Biden administration, nor are they likely to make an early return, for reasons that have to do with politics, for reasons that have to do with policy, and for reasons that have to do with the politicalization or the partisanization of the U.S.-Israeli relations, where, well, we'll talk about that, I think, a little later on.
Thanks for that. So, Wissam, I'd like to come to you next, if I could. We've talked about settlements and their implications and impact in legal terms and diplomatic, political terms, in terms of harming the peace process when there used to be one, a two-state solution, and so forth. But what about the human side? Tell us a little bit about how Israeli settlements impact ordinary Palestinian individuals and communities. And a related question, if I could, if settlements are a form of de facto annexation in terms of territory, where does that leave the people? Is it possible, is the concept of annexation of territory divorced from annexing the people? Is that something conceivable? And what are the actual implications on the ground for Palestinians?
Thank you, Khalid, and also thank you to the Middle East Institute for arranging this. It's an honor to be here with everyone. First of all, I think we need to step back and premise the questions in the proper manner. I think the situation within the Palestinian context is one of ongoing colonialism, and I think it's important to start from that basis in understanding the current status of the situation that we're facing, because it is this project of settler colonialism through which all of the other things that are being discussed manifest. The distinction that we see is the development of international law with regard to the issue of colonialism. The history of colonialism and the initiation of the Zionist project occurred within a time that, as we discussed, international law and international practice with regard to annexation has evolved. So has the perspective with regard to colonialism. And the discussion around colonialism in the past is different than the one we are seeing today in a post-colonial world, for the most part, in the rest of the world at least, whereas Palestinians continue to deal with a modern day manifestation of colonialism, despite the evolution of international law that is supposed to prohibit colonialism and put colonialism in history and not in the present. And so the Palestinian people are the colonized people dealing with colonizing oppressors. And it is this dynamic of the relationship that we need to see, and in order to not get lost in the forest for the trees. And settlements are one manifestation of this. The Palestinian people deal with the issue of settlements in many different ways, but the most sort of tangible impact is the inaccessibility to their land. The development of the settlement enterprise slowly takes away more and more land, takes away more and more natural resources. But those settlements obviously are not just buildings. You have the settlers that inhabit those settlements, and those settlers, they also play an important role in this colonial project, serving as, in some ways, the tip of the spear in the colonial project, where we see the manifestations of violence between the settlers and the Palestinian communities around them, perpetuating and serving this cycle of violence, but also serving as a way to further and further encroach on more and more Palestinian land. So the settlements start as a point in a particular piece of land, and then expand outward, and those manifestations of exploitation of resources and the friction and violence between settlers and the Palestinian communities lead to more and more violence, more and more land being taken. And so this is the slow process of colonialism that we see in the modern era. Now, to the question of, is it possible to annex a land without a people? I think there's maybe a philosophical discussion within that in terms of if the people didn't exist on the land, is it annexed? If the people are on it, what do you do with the people? I think in order to really see that, you have to look at, you have to take the colonial lens and apply it, because we've seen how colonial projects have taken the land and dealt with the people in different ways. In different colonial projects, you've seen different ways in which the people have been dealt with. And Israel is developing this innovative approach to colonialism in the 21st century, in isolating Palestinians, having a certain amount of autonomy in terms of dealing with their civil affairs to the extent that they are allowed to. But in the end, the land is the main basis on which this annexation is being perpetuated, and the people pay the price for that.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Dalia, I'd like to come to you maybe to ask you about the Israeli side of the equation. Obviously, over the years, we've seen a very pronounced rightward shift in Israeli society and politics, bringing us to the point that we see Israel is in now, the most extreme government in its history. As an analyst and as a pollster, you've seen this shift up close and probably understand it better than most. How do ordinary Israelis view the occupation and the settlements in general today, and how is that different from where Israeli society and politics were maybe 20 years ago, when we could talk about an Israeli-Palestinian peace process with a straight face?
Straight face. Okay, I'm going to start with the straight face. Thank you. First of all, I also want to join my colleagues in thanking you for organizing this and for hosting us. I remember 20 years ago very well. It was a time that was very difficult to talk about peace, because it was the middle of the Intifada and Israelis wanted to hear nothing about peace. And I remember doing lots of surveys then, thinking, how many ways are there for Israelis to say we don't want anything to do with this? But despite that, it was a better time. It was at least a recent concept that there was a peace process, and it would make a slight revival later in the decade. And then in by the time there was a renewed process in 2013 and 14 under Secretary of State Kerry, nobody paid attention anymore. That was the difference. Now, let me go back a little bit. The best proxy we have for really knowing how Israelis think about it and what's changed over time is a simple question of that we ask in every survey, which is, do you consider yourself to be right, left, or center? The reason why that question is so helpful is because it's not even a proxy. It's basically a direct window, primarily into people's attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Nothing is so clearly correlated to this question of right, center, and left in Israel as attitudes towards the conflict and every single position with relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So just to give you an example, in the late 1990s, when I began doing polling, the three groups, left, right, and center, were a little more evenly broken down. The right still had the biggest group, but it was about 40% among Jews. And I'm talking about the Jewish population because the Arab population, Palestinians in Israel, have such different relationship to the concepts of left, right, and center that we analyze them separately. So right wing was the biggest group, but it was about 40%. Centrists were about 25%. Right wing was about 25%. One of those groups was always approaching 30%. What happened was that during the moment the peace talks of the summer of 2000 fell apart, shortly after that, the Intifada started a few months later, 2 months later, I guess. And very quickly, the first thing that happened was that the portion of Israeli Jews who defined themselves as left wing within about a year or two just dropped by half. And they didn't go directly to the right wing, they went to the center. Now, which is interesting because it means that even today, centrists in Israel, people who call themselves centrists, share most of the basic outlook of left wingers, maybe not with the same enthusiasm, maybe with much more commitment to things like, Jewish identity, but they basically support the concepts of the peace process that the left wing supports because that's where they came from. But they just thought the timing wasn't right, or security was too difficult, or there's no partner. Over the years between 2000 and now, the portion of people who are right wing, which means right wing, nationalist, hardline, uncompromising on the conflict, and opposes the two-state solution, has risen from about 40% in the late 90s among the Jewish population to well over 60%. That didn't happen evenly. It didn't even happen right away with the Intifada. During the Intifada in the early 2000s, the leftists were busy fleeing to the center. It started after the 2005 Israeli settlement dismantling, what we call the disengagement from Gaza. I don't love that term because Israel dismantled settlements, but it didn't really disengage from Gaza. It still very much controls Gaza from its perimeters and above and below and everything. But that was a time that many more people began identifying with the right wing. But the real push started very clearly in my surveys. The graph just goes much more consistently upwards from 2009. Now, I'm sure everybody knows what happened in 2009, and that's that Netanyahu came back to power. But many things have happened since then, too. And there could be lots of reasons why, since then, the upward trajectory of right-wing and hardline attitudes towards the conflict has risen so significantly. Most of that change happened in the 2009 to 2023 period, and the reasons are manifold. I mean, Netanyahu ushered in a new era of much more extreme right-wing nationalism, whether it was him doing it or his coalition allies, other political parties that he cultivated. But it delegitimized the concept of peace, concessions, delegitimized the idea of being left. And that was the social environment for all of those years and getting worse. There were also, I've lost count how we count these escalations, but between 5 and 6 escalations or mini wars with Israel and Hamas and Gaza, escalations are bad for peace. They make people think it's impossible. They make it seem remote, and people just become despairing and don't think about it at all. And that's the other point I want to make. Most Israelis, when you ask how they view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or occupation, they don't think about it most of the time. In my recent survey research, it comes in dead last on the list of urgent national problems. Okay, now maybe it's heartening to note that democracy is on the rise as an urgent national problem, but if you really want to know how Israelis think about those two issues, they basically don't connect them. And it's almost cliche to say this because anybody who's been to the protests has seen this happen, but the vast majority of protesters are not there to make the connection, or, I mean, to my mind, you shouldn't have to make a connection. These are so integral, they're inextricable. But when I go to the protests and I go to the little corner where the anti-occupation people are there protesting for democracy, there are 2 people I see, Michael and his wife, Nirit. So I'm always happy, but there's only a handful of us. We're not the only ones, but it's very hard to make that case. And I think that we have to realize that for Israelis, they have convinced themselves, ironically, that they are not prepared for territorial separation, but they do believe that there is a bureaucratic governing separation. They believe that it's some other regime doing this, not related to Israel's own democratic, mostly democratic government. That's the supreme irony. It is part of Israel's government. And just to give you one small example, I know I have to finish up for the moment, but when you mentioned the administrative change that the government decided to do by transferring military to civilian powers, military powers over civilian life to a civilian minister, that's only partly an administrative change. The change could not have happened without an amendment to Israel's basic law of the government, which created the minister within the defense ministry, whose name is Bezalel Smotrich. I call him the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Annexation, because that's what he is. But what it really means is that that's a constitutional type of law. It's a quasi-crypto constitutional law, whatever. But you could say in a way that the occupation is now baked into Israel's basic laws, its constitutional level laws, and we have to keep that in mind, but the Israeli public is supremely unaware of that, or maybe I should correct that. All the information is available. They choose not to see it for many manifold psychological reasons that I'm happy to talk about afterwards. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Elia. We're going to get into the transfer of powers question in a moment in more depth. But first, I'd like to come back briefly to Wissam and maybe ask you to give us a more in-depth understanding of this Israeli government. I think most people understand that it is the most right-wing government in Israel's history, and it even includes people who, even in Israeli politics, used to be considered beyond the pale. Specifically, I'm thinking of people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is from the Kahanist party called the Jewish Power Party, who serves as the Minister of National Security, and also the minister that Dalia just mentioned, Bezalel Smotrich, who is both Minister of Finance and a special minister within the defense ministry. So the lines kind of blurred there. Smotrich, as people may recall, became recently in the headlines for calling for wiping out Hawara, a Palestinian village south of Nablus, in the past few weeks. What do you see as the end game of people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir? Is it to officially declare Israel's annexation of these areas? What specifically is their end game, and what are the practical implications for Palestinians in terms of their daily lives? And does their presence in the government, in your view, mark a shift in terms of how Israel is conducting itself in the occupied territories?
Khaled, this Israeli government, we've been hearing a lot about it, and I think it's important also to, again, step back. The development of this government is a consequence of something much bigger, and it has a lot to do, I think, with the impunity that Israel has enjoyed internationally and has been able to get away with more and more, which I think has further and further shifted the Israeli populace more to the right, feeling that they can get away with more. But I don't want to read into the psyche of Israeli society or any of the ministers. I think Smotrich provides ample reading in his document, Israel's Decisive Plan, I think it's called, which he lays out his at least intentions. Now, the fact that he laid out these intentions in writing and then became an official government minister taking on these different roles should give us an indication of where this where Israeli society is going, and where this Israeli government seeks to move forward in a plan that I think has always been in place. It has just been done in a more subtle manner over the years, and I think that had a lot to do with the context. Aaron mentioned the evolution of U.S. policy towards Israel, and I think it's important to see this evolutionary process and not disconnect In the same way, we can't disconnect settlements from the broader settler colonial enterprise. We can't disconnect colonialism from the broader imperial enterprise. And colonialism is not detached from imperialism and imperial ambitions. And the impunity that Israel has enjoyed serving in the U.S. interests from their perspective as basically a much more efficient way to manage the region than having 10 aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. This is something that Israel also appreciates, that it can get away with more and more. And as the geopolitical landscape shifts, that also plays a role in what Israel feels it will be able to get away with. The discovery of natural gas in the Mediterranean, in my opinion, was a game changer in how Israel viewed its approach to Gaza, which in my opinion was just a tactical withdrawal as opposed to any disengagement. But the broader picture is these moves that are being taken within this Israeli government are an indication of the sense of impunity that they enjoy and how much more they can get away with. And they will continue to push the envelope until there is a pushback from the international community. And this requires a different mindset, one that isn't imperial in nature, to deal with Israel and its policies toward the Palestinian people. But until that happens, this change at an incremental level, I think will only continue to grow further and further. Al-Haq has published a document on guidelines that could be looked at to assess the issue of annexation in a quantitative and qualitative manner. And all of these things are small steps moving towards this continued colonization of Palestine.
Thanks, Wissam. Michal, I'd like to come back to you and maybe ask you to break down the specifics of this transfer of authorities that took place. So back in March, as you know, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, signed an agreement with Minister Smotrich transferring broad authorities for overseeing life in the West Bank to Smotrich's portfolio. What exactly does that transfer entail, and why is it significant that these powers were transferred to a civilian rather than a military authority? And how does that relate to, of course, the question of official or de jure annexation?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the first round, the prohibition on annexation is not a capricious norm. It's a key feature of the international law-based order of the post-Second World War. And it's a key feature because it supports probably the most revolutionary idea in international law, one that all of us look as natural because we were born into the era of after two world wars. And that is when humanity basically chose to outlaw the use of force in international relations. Again, of course, there are exceptions, but in general, people who lived on this earth 100 years ago and would convene in a webinar, they wouldn't have the internet for that, but for them it would be natural that if an actor in international law has military might, they can go on wars of aggression to take over natural resources and whatever. This is no longer the case. So we need to understand how central it is. And so the laws of belligerent occupation, as they were tailored between in the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century, and then after the Second World War, they delineate a structure of governance that is not a sovereign government, but a temporary administrator. And in order to make sure that it is a temporary administrator that does not have the full powers that a sovereign has, that must guard the area and conserve it as much as possible the way it found it. The international law provides that the government of that occupied territory would be one that is committed to the well-being of the people who are occupied, that of course, and to the security of the area. And when you transfer, and that is a role that was tasked by the occupying force. The Israeli army is I made a career of criticizing how the army operates in the West Bank, how it distorted every possible article in the Geneva Convention and in the 1907 Hague regulations. But nevertheless, the Israeli army is supposed to create a buffer zone between Israeli pure interests that the government of Israel and the parliament of Israel has a commitment to advance, and the well-being of the occupied people. And I have to say that knowing how legal advisors in the army are being trained, that they are responsible for the well-being of the occupied people. What they do with it is a different issue, but at least in theory, they understand that their commitment is to security. Of course, it's an army, but mainly to the well-being of the people who live in the occupied territory. When you transfer those powers, and the transfer of powers is huge. By the way, we called the Smotrich in different names. He himself proudly calls himself a homophobe. I will add to that for me, he is the new governor of the West Bank. They didn't call it that way in the basic law of government, but that's what basically he is. His portfolio now includes such matters as planning and construction, land policy, land allocation, expropriations, energy, water, communications, you name it. And these powers are taken away from the military commander and vested with a minister and the whole civilian apparatus under him that is bound to advance Israeli society and Israeli state interest only, by definition. And I'll end with saying that this is the difference between the de facto and the Euro annexation. Before, we had the same. To every end and purpose, the Israeli army was advancing the interests of the state of Israel and Israeli society as the elected government sees it, because they were given orders by the government. And there was a huge gap between what we saw, what was done on the ground, and the rhetoric and the language that was used by the government and by the army. Now that gap has completely closed. And now the words and the deeds are the same. Israel advances in implementing, applying its sovereignty over the West Bank, just as it did with East Jerusalem. And that means that it sees itself free from all the constraints of international laws of belligerent occupation, being able to make decisions and change the territory for the long term, and I end with that, which makes it impossible for ending the occupation to be done once an opportunity arises.
Thanks for that. Aaron, I'd like to come to you next. Like the rest of us, I think the Biden administration has been aware of the inclinations of this government even before it took power. We have press reports that shows that they were concerned about precisely this sort of a transfer of authority from military to civilian bodies. Even way back in November, we're told that the administration even warned the incoming government of Netanyahu not to civilianize the occupation, and that if they moved in that direction, it would be seen as a kind of crossing the threshold into de jure annexation. And yet, when this actually happened in last spring, the administration's response was basically muted. How do you explain that that silence from the administration, especially when compared to the very vocal condemnations that we've seen of Russia's occupation and attempts to annex Ukrainian territory, for example?
I think there's a global answer to your question, or actually I guess what exactly is the policy of the Biden administration toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict answer. And then there's a very practical answer to the question. Let me start with the practical. By and large, the administration's response to the whole complex of issues concerning Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank has been largely rhetorical and performative. That mindset is quite willful. It's driven by an elemental calculation that governing for any American administration is about choosing. It's about setting priorities. This administration inherited, you could argue, two peace processes, right? One was fundamentally broken, that is the absence of any possibility of a functional, serious negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians. And from its predecessor, an intriguing functional peace process on the interstate level between Israel and a number of key Arab states. One, the first, was tough to handle, politically costly, and the prospects of success were, to say the least, reduced to a sort of optical zero. The other peace process, the one on the interstate level, seemed to be highly functional, driven by any number of factors which had nothing to do with the United States, which in the mind of this administration made it actually quite sustainable. And you've seen the administration's interest in pursuing, however unlikely over the short term, although I would not rule it out, a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The answer to the question on the civilianization of the occupation, the answer to why isn't the Biden administration adopting a more anything more than a performative position on Israeli settlement expansion, and on what is clearly a unannounced and probably not to be announced anytime soon set of policies by this Israeli government to make annexation a reality in everything but name only, and perhaps in name at some point. It grows out of this fundamental calculation. It's bad politics, particularly when you have a Republican Party that has set itself up as the Israel right or wrong party, the go-to party, and a deeply divided Democratic Party between mainstream Democrats, some of whom are quite prepared to be actually quite critical of Israel, but not to impose consequences or costs for Israeli behavior, and a small number, larger than most people would have expected, of progressives who are willing to speak out. The tougher the administration is, Khalid, rhetorically, and there's a case to be made that it should be tough rhetorically, but the tougher it is rhetorically, the greater the gap between its rhetoric and its actions. So you go out and you make an announcement from the White House in the name of the president that this administration now understands the strategy of this Israeli government. It is no longer a military occupation. The IDF is being set aside and subordinated to the political agenda of any number of Israeli ministers who have no intention of doing anything other than applying ultimately Israeli law in all aspects of the West Bank. If you make such a statement, and then you even go on to say this policy will harm fundamentally the US-Israeli relationship if it continues, then the next question, if I were writing for the New York Times or the Washington Post, is, okay, what are you going to do about it? Exactly what costs are you going to impose on the government of Israel to either preempt this process, dissuade them from continuing, or alternatively, punishing them for the actions they have taken. And frankly, I mean, this, we can go around the merry-go-round on this for a very long time. But the reality is this administration has so many other priorities that it deems to be more important than investing in what they believe to be a fight with the Israelis that will not advance the cause of Israeli-Palestinian peace, but will cost them politically. 3 American presidents, and only 3, and their respective secretaries of state, fought with the Israelis. Nixon, Ford, and Kissinger fought with the Israelis over the 3 disengagement agreements, Kissinger even threatening a reassessment. Jimmy Carter and Cy Vance fought with the Israelis on the road to Camp David I and the peace treaty. And Bush 41 and James Baker fought with the Israelis on the issue of loan guarantees on the way to the Madrid conference. They all paid a price politically, 2 Republican administrations and 1 Democrat. Jimmy Carter still doesn't understand why the Jewish community can't handle him. But the fight with the Israelis was worthwhile because in their minds, it was justified by the successes. Disengagement, Camp David I, and Madrid. This administration sees no margin whatsoever in fighting with the Israelis if you cannot advance American foreign policy objectives in the process. One final point, and I'll make a personal comment here. And I've mentioned this to you before, Colin. The greatest threat to the Republic, based on what I now see happening in Israel, the greatest threat to this Republic is not a rising China. It is not Russia and Ukraine. It is not Kim Jong-un. It is not the Ayatollah. And it is certainly not an unresolved Israeli-Palestinian problem. It is the dysfunction of our political system, which could witness once again within 18 months, the re-election of a man who is determined to fundamentally alter and undermine the nature of democracy in this country. Their calculation is very simple, the Biden administration. Nothing should be done to weaken the president, re-election prospects. And the Palestinian-Israeli problem falls under that sort of rationale and logic. So, I mean, to all your questions, I'll give you another example. Why doesn't the administration say something about a future Palestinian capital in Jerusalem? Why don't they reverse Trump's policy on laboring goods from the settlements? Why don't they reverse Pompeo's, quote, legal, unquote, opinion on settlements? Why don't they reverse Trump's recognition of Israeli sovereignty in the Golan? Why don't they resume using the word occupation? Why don't they reopen the Congen in Jerusalem? Why don't they reopen the PLO office in Washington? Why don't they reverse the recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara? Why don't they do any of these things? Some of them would actually make a difference and demonstrate a certain amount of seriousness. I think I know the answer. And I think I've probably expounded on it for a bit too long. And for that, I apologize.
No problem at all. Thank you for that. We are running short on time, so we'll probably have, after Delia, we'll have time for one more round of questions, I hope. So Delia, I want to come to you and ask you on the Israeli side. As you know, as we've all watched the past 30 weeks or so, Israel's been rocked by these anti-government, pro-democracy protests practically since this new government came to office. And at the center of this, of course, is the plans of the far-right government to pursue what they call this judicial overhaul, the first step of which we saw just a couple days ago when the Knesset voted to basically strip the court of its ability to review government decisions. For the most part, with very few exceptions, as you pointed out, these protests have barely touched on things like the occupation or Palestinian rights or the like. And in fact, in some cases, even anti-occupation elements have been demonized or even attacked physically. And yet, in your recent foreign affairs piece, which was excellent, by the way, and hopefully we'll include a link to that, you state, and I quote, "The true aim of the far right's plans to eviscerate the judiciary is to remove the last obstacle to permanent Jewish supremacy over Palestinian people throughout the land." So break it down for us. What is the link between the judicial overhaul on the one hand and the annexationist project on the other?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important question. I just want to point out that the article that you referenced, and thank you for your thoughts, was co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Yael Berda, sorry. So in terms of the connection, I mean, it's almost, again, like the government, like the occupation regime itself, it's almost inextricable from the judicial reform plan. But before I talk about the judicial reform, let's just look at the coalition agreements, or the basic guideline of the government. We call them the government guidelines, basic outlines of what this government has stated that it wants to do. The very opening line is a statement that Jews alone have the right to national self-determination in all of the land of Israel. It is basically like a mirror image of it's like kind of a copy, I should say, of the nation state law that Israel passed in 2018, but applied everywhere. And this, gives this kind of explains where they are going with it. Everything this government wants to do is put at the service of that aim, that Jews alone have the right to national self-determination, but also it gives new meaning to the term, nation. I mean, it's not new. Israel has always been really the nation of the Jews, and it's never truly accepted the non-Jews and it's as equal citizens. But just to give you one example, one of the first things this government did was change, that the new minister of what used to be called internal security was insist that the position be changed to be called the Minister of National Security. And I have to credit an unusual source with this, who is the mayor of Tel Aviv, who said at one point, what does that actually mean? There's only one nation, it's defined in Israel's basic laws, and that's Jews. And if you look at how this minister has failed to serve Israel's Palestinian citizens who are witnessing a crime spike, you kind of see what we can expect to happen when all of Israel's government is governing the West Bank, all of its civilian government. And again, keeping its control over Gaza on the outside. So that's an example that's not directly related to judicial reform. But let me get into that as well. I think it's only a matter of time. I mean, it's only a matter of time, as Aaron pointed out, until all regular Israeli civilian laws will apply in the West Bank. Some of them already do. But just to give you a very, very recent example, Israel recently expanded one of its regular domestic laws that essentially allows housing discrimination in small communities. It was already passed in 2010, and they passed an expanded version of it, not an expanded version, they amended it to be able to include more discrimination just yesterday. When Israel extends all of its laws that are discriminatory inside Israel to the rest of the West Bank, that's how it will look. And all of the judicial reforms are designed to weaken, ultimately, the power of judicial review over legislation. And then, of course, what we saw the other day, which is the stripping of or severe reduction of the court's ability to rule against executive or administrative decisions of the government. So that would relate back to, for example, the transfer of authorities, which beyond the creation of a new minister, the actual agreement transferring authorities is a government decision. So if you just take the decisions with relation to occupation that are related to the government and related to legislation, all of the entire aim of the judicial reform is to weaken any judicial oversight over legislation and government decisions. I'll give you the most relevant, I think, the most concrete example. Again, I know I'm rushing through this, but we're running out of time. Look at settlements. The right wing in Israel knows better than anybody, well, with the possible exception of Michael, who knows better than anybody, how much the Supreme Court has given its backing, without necessarily saying so or openly saying so, to settlement projects over the years, or the vast majority of settlements. I don't have time to go through all the cases, but there are very few exceptions. There are very small exceptions where the court has, in a way, ruled in ways that created small obstacles for settlers, which the state quickly found ways around them. But one of the more recent decisions along those lines that was an exception to the rule of the court ultimately, giving backing to settlements, was what we call the settlement regularization law that was passed in 2017 and frozen. 2017, yeah, it was frozen by the Attorney General, but there were immediately petitions against it, and the court struck it down in 2020. Now, that infuriated the right wing because the court just flat out rejected it. And one of their first commitments in the government guidelines and the coalition agreements was that they would work around this, that they would make amendments, for example, to the 2005 laws that allowed the evacuation of settlements, which they promptly did. And they amended those laws, and they are now trying to rebuild settlements in the West Bank that had been evacuated in the past. And so, again, the idea that the court cannot review laws that they not only plan to pass, but they're openly stating that they plan to pass these laws, and they have already done this. So the weaker the court's potential to review those decisions, the more the government has a free hand to either pass legislation or make executive decisions. And combined with their stated aim of full-blown annexation, unequal forms of annexation. In other words, getting back to your point that they can annex the territory, there is no question they plan to do that in ways that do not offer anything like equal citizenship or democracy, no representation, no rights for Palestinians. So I think that it's inseparable from the judicial reform.
Thanks, Dalia. So I'm going to ask you in this last round, each of you to be as brief as you possibly can. And I want to turn next to Michal. In your recent piece in Foreign Policy magazine, which is another excellent piece, I recommend everyone have a look. You wrote, quote, though it was not accompanied by a grand statement, the Israeli Defense Ministry portfolio transfer to Smotrich amounts to an act of de jure annexation of the West Bank and is a dangerous step toward entrenching apartheid within the territory. That's something you have already discussed. But what we haven't discussed is what should be done about it. As Aaron said, the United States is not interested in getting involved in any meaningful way, politically or even in terms of the situation on the ground. So who should step in to play a role? What should the international community be doing in this moment to address any of these problems that you point out?
I hope I have the answer to that. I will take 1 minute of my time to say something about the connection between the judicial overhaul and the annexation bid. The judicial overhaul is a product of a joint venture between different interests that the different fractions of the current coalition are advancing. And one main thrust is the settler movement. And we need to acknowledge that there was a generational change among the leadership of the settlers. In recent years, the first generations of the settler movement leadership was actually conservative, believing in incremental change, believing in slow, gradual takeover of the land. And so for them, the role of the Israeli judiciary as one that allows the settlement project, but slows it down, puts from time to time some obstacles, not ones that are a cement wall, but one that would need to make things longer. That was okay for those generations. Today's leadership is a revolutionary leadership. They want everything now, and they cannot stand a court that would slow that process down. They cannot stand the idea that instead of a robbery law like the regularization, that would immediately strip Palestinians by their thousands of their property rights and allocate the land to the settler trespassers, they will have to work for years to take over those lands. So this is the connection is very clear for me between those two things. And now about what should the international community do? The international community should do exactly what it does when a different power, maybe even a superpower, is violating the rule that prohibit annexation of occupied territory. Let's see what the international community has done when Russia annexed Crimea. And I don't want more and I don't want less. This is what I want. I want the international community to have integrity. And by the way, the international community's record on this issue is not the worst. The international community has not recognized annexations of occupied territory in the last, I think, since the 50s. Not the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem or of the Golan Heights, not the Moroccan annexation of Western Sahara. This is now being changed, not the Russian annexation of Crimea. So we have more or less a good record on that, but we don't have a good record in applying the same kind of pressure on the offending party. And that means sanctions, that means non-recognition, that means not allowing products from settlements to reach the shores. I'm not talking about labeling. I'm talking about the ability, the ability to have commerce and to put American, European cents into this illegal enterprise. So I know I'm detaching myself now with the constraints of politics, which Aaron laid down. You know, I found myself nodding all the time. There are so many constraints on the Biden administration. There are other interests and very noble interests in the world. I know that. But if the Biden administration, because of the political situation in America, has difficulties, then Europe must enter the zone. And eventually Europe is our most important neighbor. Our commerce, the Israeli commerce, is with Europe, not with America. And if America, and if the European Union, if the different European actors would do what they did with Russia, that would have made a huge difference.
Thanks, Michal. Wissam, I'd like to come to you next and ask you more or less the same question. Michal talked about comparisons with Russia. As you all know, Russian President Vladimir Putin has himself been indicted by the International Criminal Court for, among other things, Russia's forced transfer of civilians and deportations of occupied people outside of that territory. Things that we've seen successive Israeli governments do for many decades. What should the Palestinian response be? Should it pursue the ICC as an option? How viable is that as an option? And if you could comment on, now that the United States is essentially out of the equation from a political or diplomatic standpoint, what does that mean for the leadership, which has relied and pretty much continues to rely on the US for some sort of deliverance?
I mean, the Palestinians, as the colonized people, their ability to respond is limited, and I think the thing that is at risk is the integrity of the international system. We are putting to test the tools that have been made available and designated by the international community as the legitimate tools to achieve the right to self-determination, using things like the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the Human Rights Council, the UN mechanisms. This is part of the decolonization process, to use these mechanisms to end the colonial process and achieve the right to self-determination. The Ukrainian people didn't have to go through all these channels. For some reason, the political will was there instantaneously. And this goes back to one of the first points I made, is this issue of imperial interest, foreign policy considerations. But I think if there is going to be a change, we need a shift in the political calculus that is being made. This cost-benefit analysis, I don't want to repeat all the things that should be done, as Michael mentioned, or answer the question that Aaron raised as to why they haven't done all these things. But I think looking at things in the short term is the problem, and why Israel is continuing to enjoy this impunity. So long as Israel continues to benefit as the exception within this international system and enjoy this impunity, I think long term, it undermines the integrity of the international system as a whole, and the rest of the international community will be in a worse position for it in the long term. Now, the challenge is getting politicians to think long term rather than short term political interest, and this is where I think the role of civil society can step in, hopefully. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Dalia, I'd like to come to you next. We've seen how this shift from de facto to de jure annexation has helped cement the two-tiered legal system that exists now in the occupied territories, something you describe as separate and unequal legal regimes, something others have described more explicitly as apartheid, whereby Israeli Jews are full citizens of the state and subject to civilian laws and procedures, and Palestinians living just a few kilometers, or in some cases, maybe even a few meters away, live under an entirely different military regime, including military courts and so on. I want to ask you about this framing that is emerging as a consensus among human rights groups, including groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and as well as Israeli human rights organizations, about that this is a situation of apartheid. I want to ask you to comment on that. But also, if I could, since we talked in your last response, you talked about this connection between the anti-government protests and the occupation. Do you see an opportunity now that the Israeli public, at least a large segment of it, is mobilized to begin to see that connection? And is there even space for making common cause with the anti-occupation forces that have existed and are sort of been marginalized over the years? Or is that sort of pie in the sky? So I know it's unfair. I'm asking you two questions in 3 minutes, but do your best, please.
No, they are closely related, actually. I mean, I was wondering why you're asking me the apartheid question, because, this is putting everybody on the spot, and all of us have a different, we come to it from different places. I think when it comes to the West Bank, and I'm not dismissing Gaza here, but Israel has much more direct control, directly over the lives of people in the West Bank. I don't think there's any dispute that from a political perspective, now I'm setting aside the international law legal definition of apartheid, but the political perspective, the regimes that we know of, and the legal definition, which emphasizes systems in place in order that are designed to perpetuate the privilege or superiority or supremacy of one group over another, where the concept of race has been, by law, expanded through other international conventions to include other groups. Of course, I mean, it's impossible not to see that. That is the fundamental nature of the occupation regime. And just to make it clear, it's not, when I say separate and unequal, one regime is a place where people have rights and representation. Those are the Jewish citizens who live as settlers in the West Bank. It's not like, it sounds like a slogan to say separate and unequal. Palestinians are living under an authoritarian military regime. They have, law is arbitrary. It's selected from a huge and incomprehensible range of laws. Their lives are governed in ways that we can't imagine. It has nothing to do with how we live lives. So, and the intention of these systems is to keep it that way. So I think from a political science perspective, in terms of who rules and who governs and what counts in our understanding comparatively as apartheid in the West Bank, it's almost indisputable. But I think the bigger question that probably the reason why you're asking me is because of my original career as a political consultant and a political strategist. And I have to say that the question about whether it counts as apartheid has primarily, in my mind, become a question of whether that helps anything. And I think that I keep revisiting the question, should I be making this my point in all of the talks that I give and analysis and articles that I write? And from what I can see, the strategic impact of using the word apartheid has a very mixed very mixed result. And the overriding result seems to be to solidify the camps that people are already in. Those on the side of human rights, those on the side of ending occupation, those on the side of Palestinian self-determination and human rights, say it and it's fine and there's no controversy for the most part. And those on the side of, starting from what we consider to be a pro-Israel perspective, I don't consider it a pro-Israel perspective, but let's say that, the first thing that matters is Israel's security and national identity. Those people are going to always view the use of that term as fundamentally anti-Semitic and delegitimizing the entire cause. So if there is a way of making common cause with the democracy protests and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have to come to the conclusion that explaining that this is an apartheid regime, at least in the West Bank, some of my colleagues argue that it is also in Israel, is probably not going to help make that connection. I do think there's an opportunity now for a huge range of Israelis. Remember, if you're talking just about the centrists, that's 25% of Jewish Israelis. Actually, it's 25% of everybody, because Palestinian citizens in Israel also have about 25% who consider themselves centrist. But that's an enormous opportunity to try to explain why these two issues are inextricable, not why they're connected, why they are inextricable. And they have to consider the occupation as part of the assault on democracy. But I don't think, I mean, and the people that have to change their minds are Israelis. You know, we've talked so much about the international system. I have plenty to say on it. I wish I could. I agree with much of what's been said, but I just don't think salvation for the Palestinians will come solely from the international community for many reasons that have been described here. If Israelis don't change their perspective on this, the public, the government, civil society, opinion formers, it won't happen. And so I have to leave it at that. I think strategically it's very problematic, but you know, politically and legally, certainly in the West Bank, I think it's indisputable.
Thanks, Adia. We are almost out of time, but we have time, I think, for just one more response from Aaron. You'll have the last word. I want to pick up on the point that you left off with in your last response, in terms of the U.S. role. As you know, the U.S. is not a bystander in terms of Israel and the Palestinians. It is very strongly on one side. It provides $4 billion of very intensive military assistance, but also provides political, economic, commercial, all sorts of other incentives and goodies in terms of the special relationship. And so by doing nothing, the United States is still actually actively doing something, which is supporting one side. In the past, the US used to offset that sort of imbalance by at least attempting to pursue a peace process of some kind that also took into account Palestinian needs and interests. That's no longer the case. And so wouldn't the responsible thing to do, I mean, there's a lot more that the US could do besides rhetorical, but things that could actually make a difference in people's lives on the ground. But with that in mind, I want to come to something that former Secretary of State John Kerry said about a decade ago. And he warned that the window for a two-state solution is shutting, and if that a two-state agreement wasn't reached in 1.5 to 200 years, it's, quote, over. That was more than a decade ago. Today, a growing number of analysts and scholars are saying it's already too late for a two-state solution. So given the US role as clearly supporting Israel in and essentially underwriting the occupation in a lot of ways, wouldn't the responsible thing for the United States to do is to abandon the idea of a two-state solution, which, as you said, is performative? It's essentially a talking point, and look for ways on the ground to improve, to address this highly unequal reality that exists on the ground. Wouldn't that be a more responsible thing to do than simply washing your hands of it while actually underwriting what's happening? Sorry, you're muted.
None of us can see around corners, right? I mean, 75 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, neither the borders nor the identity of the Israeli state is fixed, right? 75 years after the creation of the United States in 1851, 9 years before a civil war that would fundamentally create a second American Revolution and transform the identity of the United States. But 75 years after independence, neither the borders nor the identity of the United States was yet determined. Now, again, I can't be prophetic. Usually my projections are wrong, but I don't see the purpose right now of, frankly, abandoning one illusion right now, which is the pursuit of a two-state solution, to somehow embrace another illusion and put the United States in a position where, as you know, if in fact equality of every human between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River now becomes the policy of the United States, here again, the gap between that rhetorical position and the steps that the United States would have to take in order to facilitate, transform the current situation would put the United States in an virtually an impossible position. And as you know, it would put the United States directly in a conflict with Israel. So is it the responsible position to take? I mean, on paper, it strikes me that it's certainly a reasonable position, but I just don't see any way whatsoever, forget the politics, that the United States would commit itself to such a strategy, because it's tethered to the notion that within this polity, within this one state reality, it is somehow conceivable and or imaginable that everybody would live as equals with dignity and mutual respect. I just don't see how you reconcile two national movements, one an established state with a fundamentally symmetry of power, to another situation of a people trying to negotiate its way out of occupation and build institutions at the same time. I just don't think the whole thing computes. And frankly, in the end, it's an impossible situation to contemplate. I think for the moment, unfortunately, we're left with something that is a one-state reality, but is a sort of a threesome. You've got Hamas in Gaza, you've got the PA in control, quote unquote, of 40% of the West Bank, and you have the state of Israel. I suspect for the foreseeable future, that's the kind of paradigm that we're going to be dealing with.
Thank you, and we're going to have to leave it at that. Thank you to our excellent speakers, Dr. Dalia Scheindlin, Michael Sfard, Aaron David Miller, and Wissam Ahmed for a really, really rich discussion. I know we could have gone for at least another hour or more, but thank you all, and thank you all